I am really not very good at sanding and painting, and today as I further prep my race car for its first drive, you're going to see why. I've had this Formula 1000 race car for a few months now and I haven't even driven it yet. As frustrating as that is, I have a list of things to work through, and today I'm going to cross off a couple more items in terms of bodywork. When I was looking to buy this car, there was only one photo and the buyer convinced me that it was pretty much turnkey and ready to go. However, after driving 450 kilometers to collect it, there were some things that I wasn't told about, including this damage on the nose cone as well as this large crack in the actual front wing. Let's remove the whole nose cone so we can get a better look. This front aerofoil is made from fiberglass and this damage is not just superficial. There are some scrapes that I could ignore, but the main problem is this large crack. It split the whole way through to the hollow center. So that needs repair no matter what. The nose cone damage is superficial, but if I'm fixing the wing, I might as well fix this at the same time. So onto the to-do list it went. I've been alive long enough to know my own strengths and weaknesses. I'll happily sit for hours designing something in 3D to be CNC'd or 3D printed, but when it comes to prepping and sanding and painting, I've got absolutely no patience. So with that in mind, I took the front wing off the car, contacted a local fiberglass repair place and took the wing down to them. I had a pretty good impression of them the first time I met them. Seemed like a really nice old guy, a craftsman, someone who took a lot of pride in his work. He told me it would be $1,200, told me it would be 3 weeks, and then I waited, feeling pretty confident about how I was spending my money. And then 4 weeks passed, I contacted him. He said it was all ready. But then when I went down, it wasn't actually finished. So he reduced the price from $1,200 to $1,000 because he hadn't painted it. But that was the whole point of me going to him. And when I got home and checked it out properly, I could see that it was even worse than that. Not only had he not painted it, but he hadn't sanded all of it either. Inspecting the underside of the wing, it was really quite rough. It wasn't blended in well at all, and the excuse he gave to me was that it was gel coat and it couldn't be sanded, but he explained to me that it was gel coat when I dropped it off, which means he knew that all along. So in reality, the guy just couldn't be bothered and he ditched it on me, giving me a slight discount to keep me happy. I was polite at the time, but happy I was anything but. This section on the nose cone was a lot smoother, but would still need some sanding to get it ready for painting. Honestly, I was really annoyed about this, because rather than having something crossed off, instead that job was extended. I'd already spent $1,000 on this, so I didn't want to spend any more taking it to a painter, so I decided I'd just have to do it myself, as painful as that was going to be. Truth be told, there was already one item on the list that required painting, and that was painting the mesh. Inside the side pods, when the car was first built, for some reason they decided to paint it white, but I thought it would look a lot better if I were to paint it black and make it a lot darker. Since the bodywork had remained off since an earlier video so I could work through this list, now was the perfect time. So I grabbed some painter's tape and the local newspaper and I masked up both side pod entries. The idea was to make it foolproof to keep overspray off the bodywork, and this one worked pretty well. My daughter helped me by painting one side and I painted the other. I cleaned the surface of the mesh to remove any grease and muck, and then I got to it, applying 2 coats with a bit of a gap to dry in between. And a couple of days later, as I removed the newspaper and the tape, I discovered that this had actually gone to plan. It's pretty rare for me to paint something without stuffing it up, so I was quite pleased with the way this one had turned out. And as a bonus, it gave me a whole item to cross off my list. So painting the mesh, it turns out, was a piece of cake, but if I'm honest, I was expecting it to be. So how would I fare when painting the front wing? So with cautious optimism, I taped up the pieces between the airfoil and the nose cone. Because I hate sanding so much, I use this as an excuse to buy a new electric sander. Basically my thinking is, if I hate doing it, then I want it to be as fast and efficient as possible, but if I'm honest with myself, it's just another way that I corner cut. Surprisingly, the bog and filler was quite easy to sand, and it wasn't long until I had the high spots removed. Other people probably would have spent more time getting this part smooth, but personally I was looking forward to moving on. And that meant sanding the nose cone, and as you can see, there's some bits where you can see the fiberglass strand, although in real life there's translucent resin above this and it's not quite as bad as it looks. So again I turned to my electric sander trying to complete this as fast as possible, and it really didn't take too long, which means at this stage I was pretty happy. I was also feeling that my power tool purchase was completely justified. After the sanding was done, I vacuumed everything down and then got a wet rag to try and remove any remaining dust. The aerofoil lip still looks pretty patchy here, but to the touch it actually felt not too bad. Following this, I employed some wax and grease remover to remove any fingerprints, oils, just any contaminants that would prevent the paint from sticking. And following that, I once again turned to blue tape and newspaper with the help of my daughter to mask up all of the black sections of the wing. Time to paint the nose cone with a generic white gloss paint. This one had a primer built in, and that's why I'm not priming this first. What you're seeing here represents quite well my impatience when it comes to painting. I get way too close, I put it on way too thick, and I try and achieve everything in a single coat. I know I'm not meant to do it like this. I know I'm meant to do light coats, building them up to avoid drips, but I just don't have the patience. I'll say it again. I absolutely hate sanding and painting. Unsurprisingly, the results were appalling. You can see some poor bug has met its end, being stuck in my thick paint, but there's also drips everywhere. And in case you're having trouble seeing them with the white paint, I put this image through Photoshop and it becomes even uglier. Looking at this is probably one of the worst jobs I've ever done painting, even though it's on something that should be really important. To the right of the nose cone, you can even see where I tried to wipe the drips off with a cloth when they were still wet. At this point, I wasn't surprised, but I was pretty angry, frustrated with my own efforts, but also just really upset with the fiberglass guy for letting me down after I'd already paid $1,000. But ultimately, I didn't have much choice but to push on and start working on the black wing section. So after unwrapping the wing and wrapping back up the nose cone with newspaper, I again took the wax and grease remover to remove any contaminants and any final bits of dust before I started to paint. This is the same can of gloss black that I was using for the mesh. And here I was trying really hard to put it on lighter so it wouldn't drip everywhere. And this time I think I actually did a much better job of that, building up 3 coats over an afternoon. The next morning, by my standards, it was looking pretty fantastic. It wasn't perfectly smooth, but unless you knew what you were looking for, you wouldn't think that it had just been painted and it just had some general race car wear and tear. Thinking that maybe I wasn't so bad at painting after all, I decided to peel off the newspaper to see how the white had gone, but lo and behold, in a mix of disgust and impatience in trying to get the black done, I had put the newspaper on far too early and it had become embedded inside the white paint. I know composites is where it's at with race car parts, but paper mache is probably not what I had in mind. More frustration once again, and this is the reason I hate painting so much. The only silver lining was that I was forced to redo it and hopefully do a better job the second time round. But that also got off to a really bad start. Remember how I said I was impatient? Well, I broke up my electric sander, but I don't think enough days had passed for the old paint to fully cure. So as I tried to sand it, it just kept on gumming up, which was evident in the speed that I was going through sanding pads, and you could also see the muck building up on the surface of the nose cone. Now that it's over, I can have a laugh and say that this type of a disaster was a first even for me. You might want to look away for this next bit because my solution was graphic. Rather than my sander, I decided to grab a 3D printer scraper and hack at all of the semi-dried paint to get it off. I can only describe this idea as savage, but it was also quite effective. At an earlier stage, I tried the same thing with a razor blade that was leaving marks, so this was pretty sophisticated by comparison. Even so, it probably took around half an hour of solid scraping before I could get it to the point where I could go back to the sander with quite coarse grit, which removed the rest of the dodgy paint, but left some quite heavy marks. So I switched to a finer grade sandpaper and I spent a bunch more time with the electric sander trying to get everything smooth once more. Eventually, I was happy, ready to proceed, and wrapped up the black section of the wing with newspaper and tape once more. Then for a final time, I cleaned everything down with wax and grease remover. The moment of truth, repainting. And although it might not look like it here, I put on much lighter coats. In fact, after the first one was done, you could still see unpainted sections through the first coat, which for me is completely unheard of. From memory, I applied 5 coats, waiting roughly an hour in between, as per the instructions on the can. As you can see, the plan all along was to not paint the whole panel, but blend the new paint into the old gel coat white. And if I was painting in any other colour, this would have been obvious, but in white it was quite forgiving. The next day, I peeled off the newspaper to inspect my handiwork, and the first win is that it didn't stick to any of the black paint. Overall, everything was actually looking pretty good, and when I put it on the car, I hope you'll agree that there's no obvious places where I've butchered this. I'm not saying for 1 minute that this is perfect, but by my standards, it looks like just general race car wear and tear, and you would expect that maybe I purchased the car like this, rather than me have any involvement with sanding and painting. There was unfortunately a single drip on the right hand side of the nose cone, and this was on the side that was in the shadow and I just couldn't see it properly. I'm disappointed, but there is no way I am painting this for a third time, so it's gonna have to stay. You might notice some swirls in the black wing. That's actually from the vacuum cleaner when I took off the dust, so if I can bring myself to do it in future, I'll have to try and lightly polish these out. But ultimately, job done, and I was glad this saga was finally over. Of course, I hope there's not a next time that I need to repaint something, but if there is, I'm going to try and seek a professional, but research much more. Now that this item is finally crossed off the list, I'm going to ask you to pretend that this whole thing never happened. This video is an example of motorsport on a budget. You have to do a lot of things yourself, and sometimes you're forced to do things yourself that you're really not that good at. I identified this as one of those areas. I took a punt on finding a professional and they let me down, and here we are. Ultimately, I'm happy enough with it. Unless you would look really close on the car, you wouldn't even notice. So unless you've seen this video, just watching the car on track, you'd have no ideas of the horrors that took place here. I'm going to keep working through that list, and I'm very much looking forward to getting to something more in my area of expertise and playing to my strengths. So you might be wondering, what happens with this project if I run out of budget? Well, a wise but admittedly biased person recently told me that you can sleep in your car, but you can't drive your house. So I think that means I have to buy more race cars just to look after my family.